evening.
10 seconds, okay.
Oh, 10 seconds, okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Grant Cameron, and this is Triangle panel number 2. I'm joined today by my assistant, Desta Barnaby, who's in the background, who will be producing this. And I'm also joined by my assistant, Nicole Sakach, who has the honor of being the only woman on this panel and the one who has to herd all the cats. She's going to be hosting this. We actually Nicole and I did a part 3 last night, where we actually have 3 women. We actually did a number of full interviews. For example, the Phoenix Lights, the Hudson Valley, those were all separate interviews that we did. And we do a little excerpt pieces in panel number 3. But Nicole Sakach on her Nicole Sakach YouTube channel will have all the full interviews that we did with people like Lynn Katai and Linda Zimmerman and Melinda Leslie and my friend from Hollywood, Chris Peters. So those will all be broadcast on Nicole Sakach's YouTube. How are you doing, Nicole?
I'm doing great today, Grant. I'm still, in the middle of Triangle Palooza here. So
yeah. Well,
I know I'm going to see one now.
Yeah. Well,
Fingers crossed.
You've got some, I'll list the members. You guys are almost like the who's who of ufology on here. We have David Marler, who is probably the expert on triangles. He wrote the book on triangles. He's joining us today. We have Lee Spiegel, famously for almost everything. He's been in this probably as long as I have. His famous story at the UN, putting together the UN UFO initiative. Huffington Post now has a podcast on KGRA. Used to have a radio show on NBC, I think. Has done almost everything. Has a story he's going to tell us about triangles. We're also joined by Preston Dennett, who told us now he's got like 30 books. And he's got his own personal sighting he's going to share with us. We have Sam Maranto, and he's going to talk to us about the famous Illinois triangle sightings. Then we have some military witnesses. We have Terry Lovelace, who has, I say, one of the 10 best experiencer stories in the business. But today he's going to tell us about a triangle story that involved nuclear weapons, military himself, a dramatic story of triangles. Bob McGuire, who's Nicole's military intelligence and science advisor, is joining us here today. We have Chase Williams. I'll let him introduce himself. He's been a friend of mine for a couple of years. He's helped me on a number of different issues. Has a very unique background and is an experiencer, has his own story. We have another military witness, Jeff Kingsbury, who's going to tell his story for the first time. We have Joseph Burkes, who was one of the original C5 leaders in California and has a triangle story he's going to tell us. And I think that's about it. So I'd say we start with David Marlar because he's written the book. And Nicole, you can take it from here, and good luck.
All right. Thank you, Grant. That was a wonderful introduction for everybody. And yeah, in lieu of time, I'm just going to turn it on over to David. So thank you for being here, David. The floor is yours.
Can you see me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you and Grant for hosting this. When Grant first reached out and mentioned this, I had told him that years ago, I had envisioned having a conference of people that have had similar sightings, namely of these triangular UFOs. But due to distance, finances and such, it just really, precludes many people from trying to participate in something like that. So given the COVID situation, given this new norm that we're all dealing with virtual meetings, I think this is just a fantastic idea and the timing's perfect. So I just want to thank you for setting this up. I feel like the odd person out today because I don't have a personal sighting of my own. I certainly wrote the book looking at the history of triangular UFOs. And really the impetus for that was back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, many people were putting forth the idea of this TR-3B and suggesting that all of these triangles are military. And I don't know about the audience members, but anytime people use, these all-inclusive statements, all or none, I'm a little leery I think we all know UFOs and life otherwise, things aren't in black and white. It's shades of gray. And as I was seeing people put forth the idea that first, these triangles are something new, and second, they must all be military, I'm sitting looking at cases that I had in my own files of triangles, not just depicting triangular UFOs, but triangular UFOs with similar lighting characteristics, and more importantly, the exotic flight characteristics that quite often modern day witnesses report. And the parallels were striking. So I decided to try to put together at least some of the best cases. Admittedly, the book is just the tip of the iceberg as far as all of the cases that I've gathered. And literally just last week, I came across this report. You can see the headline right there.
Mm-hmm.
And this one was from Washington State. The date of the sighting was May 26th, 1965. And it was in a newspaper 2 days later. And it describes a very slow, silent, large triangular object that was moving over a nuclear weapons area in Washington State. So that's just one of several I've just recently come across. I focus primarily on the historical accounts, one, because I don't think a lot of people have access to some of the data that I do. So I'm trying to share that with a wider community and at least expand the framework of the discussion. Certainly, and I've acknowledged this many times in lectures, some of the more modern day reports, say in the last 20 years, could in fact be military. I'm not suggesting that all of these are not military. Again, I think it's shades of gray. I've often said there's three sides to the triangle. I think there's three potential explanations. One is military, two is possibly extraterrestrial, or let's say non-earthly based technology. And three, which I think is the most viable explanation, is a combination of both. I think some of these are military, some of these maybe, let's just say, someone else's technology, for lack of a better term. I'm also struck with looking at the historical record, the number of military reports, not just from United States Air Force, but MOD files, as well as the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, who in 1957, starting in November 57 into the spring of 58, had a wave of, quote, their words, not mine, triangular spaceships was how they were described in 57. So I think I've established with the book and with subsequent research and lectures, and again, with some of the more recent accounts that I'm coming across, that whatever we're dealing with, it's nothing new. Certainly there's been an increase in sightings, which again, could lend to the fact that some of these are in fact military craft people are seeing. So I think we need to have an open mind. I don't think, any one explanation with triangular UFOs or UFOs otherwise really answer all the questions. And I think we're dealing probably with multiple phenomena, not just one phenomenon. And so that's really all I had, unless people had some questions. I did want to mention that just recently, I have acquired about 150 reels of microfilm of scrapbooks, news clippings from Jan Aldridge, UFO historian. And I've garnered about 4 or 5 historical accounts. I posted on Facebook just recently, 2 or 3 from 1957, describing triangular objects with the white lights at each corner. And in addition, one of the reports from Camarillo, California, described multiple witnesses seeing a triangle moving with the flat side as the leading edge. Again, that's one of the arguments, I think, against the fact that this is a triangular aircraft. Because, I mean, admittedly, most aircraft are going to have a point as the leading edge. That's the most, makes the most aerodynamic sense. So, again, it's interesting to look, get people all across the world reaching out and sharing their experiences. One of the comments that I often get, or questions at conferences, is, in my historical research, did you come across any abduction accounts in association with triangles? And I always like to state the newspapers and the military files I'm looking at are from the early 90s. Admittedly, we weren't even in the UFO field talking widely about abductions in the 1950s. There was the contactee movement. So you're not going to see those narratives written about in newspapers. However, since lecturing across the country, talking about this on various shows, I have had people contact me claiming that they've had abduction experiences. And I think Terry Lovelace is with us today. And I think he has one of the more compelling accounts with regard to that. So that's kind of my prefatory statement. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to address those.
Yeah,
go ahead, Grant.
I know. I think we have some questions, but we'll wait till we go to the discussion period after.
Oh,
I have one
perfect.
question for you, but we'll get through everybody's statements first.
Sure. Excellent. Okay. And maybe we'll play the name game today. So David just passed it off to Terry Lovelace. So we did a full-length interview with Terry. I think it was just about maybe a month ago or a month and a half ago, Terry. And
yeah, about that.
On my YouTube as well. And, I think Desda was in the background for that interview as well. And I think she probably felt the same way I did. I was just blown away at several parts of your story. I had heard so little of it, and I was just in awe. So I'm very glad to have you back here today to share your triangle experience with us. So go ahead, Terry.
Well, thank you. That's an awesome introduction, and I appreciate it. Yeah, my name is Terry Lovelace. My event goes back to 1977, June of 1977. I was active duty in the United States Air Force from 1973 to 1979. And in 1977, my friend, the guy I worked with, came up with an idea that we should go camping. And neither one of us had ever been camping in our lives, knew nothing about camping, but that's what we did. And we drove to a place called Devil's Den State Park. That's an Arkansas State Park in the northwest corner of Arkansas, just across the Missouri border. At the time, we were both stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base, which is off of Interstate 70. It was a remote area of Missouri back in 1977. It's built up now, and they've since yanked out the Minuteman II ICBMs and relocated the nuclear-armed B-52s, and now Whiteman is home to the B-2 bombers. But we lived on a nuclear base, and we had some experiences and heard some experiences from other people about lights around the bunker area in particular. But my event with the triangle, 1977, we ended up we got to Devil's Den State Park. We chose not to stay in the campground, but we found a piece of high ground, an elevated plateau that's still there, and the top of it is just as flat as a pool table. And I had never bothered to look up an aerial photograph of it. After all these years, I was sure, the place had to be covered with 40-year-old mature trees by now, but it's not. It's just knee-high grass, and someone clear cuts that with a tractor. So for whatever reason, I don't know. But it's odd. My friend and I were kind of kicked back on air mattresses and just enjoying our evening. And, this sounds so cliche. I'm almost embarrassed when I tell it, but I think it's important to the story. And that was that the sounds of the forest fell silent. The crickets, the tree frogs, all that stuff that makes noise, that stuff all went silent immediately before we saw this thing. And I think that was significant. And it certainly unnerved me. But my first time spending the night in the woods, 22 years old. My friend had his head turned to the left. And he was looking at something on the horizon. And he asked me, he's like, Terry, were those lights there before? And his torso was in the way. So I had to half stand and step in back of him to see. And on the horizon, there were 3 dots of light that formed a perfect little triangle. And they were too far off the horizon to have been, a train or parking lot lights. And they were absolutely stationary, so we didn't think it was an aircraft. And while we're watching them, they rotated like they were on an axis. And that got us kind of excited. And then it started an ascent up into the sky. And that's the first time that I noticed a feeling of calm wash over me. Our reaction to this thing was inappropriate. We were just passive, calm, almost sedated, mildly disinterested. It was a weird place, and we were just observers more so than participants. And we watched this thing climb up to the sky till it reached the ceiling of I don't know how big, but or how high, and then it began a gradual descent. And as it did, it kind of tumbled and did the somersault-like thing. So we'd see the three lights, and then the one light come back up around, and I had the impression, and I don't know where it came from, but I had the impression this thing was moving with purpose. I mean, it wasn't just out of control tumbling. And as it descended, it came over. We were elevated. Where we were camped, we could see the tops of the trees. So we were on a piece of high ground. And we were thankfully camped off to the side near a tree line. And this thing stopped directly over our heads at about 3,000 feet. And there's not a word said between us. We're just watching this thing. And there were some lights that came down from underneath this thing in the center. And kind of lights that played around the campsite. A red laser-like thing that darted around the campsite for a few seconds. And then we went to bed in the middle of this. I was suddenly just incredibly sleepy, like I was sedated sleepy. And my friend and I both went into our tent and crashed. And I woke up some hours later. Both of our watches had stopped. We had mechanical wind-up watches. Both of our watches had stopped at 2:40 a.m. So when we woke up, we had no idea what time it was, but we woke up to a flood of lights and got to our knees, peeked outside the tent, and this thing that had been 3,000 feet over our heads had now descended and was 30 feet over this plateau, or I called it a meadow. And we saw little guys walking around in this meadow. And I first thought they were kids, and I'm like, Toby, man, what are these kids doing out here in the middle of the night? And he's like, Terry, those ain't no little kids. And I looked close, and he was right. I mean, they were too far away to get a really close look, but I could tell that, they weren't human beings. And the thing that we saw was not a one-story TC-3B. It wasn't, what we saw wasn't made at Boeing. I'll put it that way. And it was deep. And I had never heard of a deep triangle until I read David's book and read an account of, I think it was the Hudson Valley. A lady in the Hudson Valley saw one that was very similar to mine. I think she described it as 5 stories tall. But this thing was enormous. And there was a lot more that happened, but that's the core event that happened in 1977.
Wow.
Did you also have an event where you were with the military where there was one over top of the silo? Was that a triangle as well?
Semi-triangle. You know what it was like? It was more like the thing that they saw in Rendlesham. I described it as a black diamond. It was a multifaceted kind of thing that was a matte black in color. And there were, because we were at a launch control facility, we were there because a missile technician had fallen and broken a leg. So we were medics, first responders, so we drove out to pick this guy up. And when we got there, there was just a ton of security police running around. And we're like, what the heck's going on? And this was an extremely bitterly cold January night. And we were ordered by, I remember if he was a captain or a lieutenant. Anyway, we were ordered by an officer in the scene to pull our ambulance over and wait for further instructions, and stay in our ambulance. So, of course, my friend was kind of impulsive. Hops out, says, "I got to see what's going on." So he comes around, opens my door, and drags me. I had to grab my parka, drags me out of the ambulance, and that's when I saw the security police vehicles had floodlights, and they had this thing lit up. And it was matte black in color, about the size of a full-size van, and it was multifaceted. And I didn't see any lights on it of any kind. And it hung, 50 feet or more above the blue dome that was atop the launch tube. and stayed there motionless. And we watched it. Everybody was just awestruck by this thing. Watch it for a few minutes, and then it just shot off. It shot off like from 0 to 300 miles an hour in a flash of an eye, and it was gone. So yeah, that was the 1975 incident. And we never thought it was anything extraterrestrial. You know, I thought extraterrestrial stuff was saucer shaped. You know, I thought this, you know, was. And our CEO told us, you know, look, guys, that was a prototype helicopter. You can't talk about it, okay? So, you know, our biggest question was it ours or was it from Russia? You know.
Right.
Thanks.
I think what we learned yesterday from our guests is that what we call triangles, I think we all have the iconic black triangle with the lights in each point. But what we've learned is that these triangles can sometimes be chevrons or boomerangs. And like now you've brought up these diamond-like or almost pyramid-shaped triangle craft as well. And we did invite Jim Peniston or a few of his researchers, and they just couldn't work it out to be here with us today. So that was a shame, and maybe we'll get them later on to talk about their craft of unknown origin. But I would like to kick it over to, in lieu of staying in the Midwest now, maybe, because Terry just shared his story from Missouri, I'd like to kick it over to Sam Maranto, and if he could take over and start telling us about some of these Illinois sightings.
Well, I tell you what, we should tag team Dave and I think, when it comes to many of these reports. My mentor, being Dave, who got me started in doing the research that I have been doing here in the Midwest. I started out doing independent research years and years ago. My first experience was in 1959. And I didn't see anything more unusual than a orb that flew over my shoulder and scared the hell out of me as a child. And deservingly so, because I was throwing stuff down my uncle's brand new well. I had to test the depth of that. So I was shunned off and said, go back there and do something else. And I was throwing rocks across the channel, and this orb comes flying over my shoulder. And it startled me, gave me a shock, actually. I felt it go through my body. And I watched it go over and back of a tree and went up to the clouds. And my aunt was yelling for me, apparently, for some period of time. And she asked me where I was, because she came back there and looked for me. I wasn't there. And that startled me, because when I got her attention, or she got my attention, I should say, it was dark out. So something transpired where time had lapsed for a period of time, and it scared the living bejesus out of me. Went home, and I wasn't in a good state of mind, not even good enough to watch my new favorite show on Sunday, which was Dennis the Menace. So I crawled in bed, which was unlike me, and covered my head up. Didn't tell anybody about this story till I was 20-some years old. And by that time, I had a strong interest in working in various aspects of the paranormal, various studies out in the community. And ufology grabbed me. I didn't grab it. I joined MUFON in, I believe it was around 2000. I was working on a case independently, coming back from doing a radio show that had to do nothing with UFOs. Turned on the radio, and person was talking about a sighting in New Lenox, Illinois, and the object was seen all the way to Joliet. The object actually was seen by a number of people, and clearly would qualify for a mass sighting, something Dave and I both have a strong interest in. The object flew over an interstate where a private pilot, and his fiance were driving along and seen this object. And he called up and started doing his own investigation. He was on the radio, and so I went over to his place of business. Was a cafe, and it was soon after that I ran into the assistant state director at that time, Bill Leone, and Sue Morawski, and they were working on the case. I went and purchased the maps. At that time, they had to buy the Stilwell maps from the county, to get the layout of the land. And we went over them. In fact, I donated them to MUFON. I became involved with MUFON soon thereafter, became an investigator, I believe about a year afterwards, and had my own experience with the triangular case. Would be a sighting that I worked on with Billy Oney, which was a black orb that was hovering in a strategic area. It was over a highway near was actually a group of office buildings, probably 15 stories high. And it stayed there stationary. There was a ring of bluish neon around the center of it. And from the bottom was a corona, a gold corona of light illumination. The security guard went out, walked up into the two-story high parking area and was able to look so close at it that he would be able to reach out and touch it. And it had an unusual sheen and it almost looked transparent, but it was black and it had the bright brilliance of that neon blue. The object moved off, eventually flew off, and he watched it go off into the west where it met up with a large black triangular object. It circled the object twice and then went up into an area of recessed area inside the triangle. Adjoining it was another orb, very similar black orb coming from the southwest, did the same routine and went up in an opposite section of the craft. Either way, it was very interesting. 14 witnesses, one of which had to get psychiatric help afterwards. The security guard got in trouble for calling us and actually was reassigned to a different location. But that was my first triangular case. And soon thereafter, we had the mass sightings, of course, of 1999 of New Year's Eve in Rockford, Illinois. Now, these sightings were not just local in Rockford, Illinois, and Nicole's nodding, she knows this quite well. It wasn't just local, it was also in, of course, south central Wisconsin, all the way over to the western edge of the state. And of course, this comes on the heel of what was known to be the very popular, or I should say on the toe, of the very popular sightings that were handled by Dave Marlar in Southern Illinois. This being the Southern Illinois sightings that started much sooner when you take all these other ones in conjunction. There were sightings that we've heard about in Plainfield that was on the first. Then we had, as you could look in on this backdrop of my photo up here, to the bottom, that right column, or excuse me, the left column, those two pictures, the one in the center is a drawing of a sighting near Scott's Air Force Base. In fact, that's where they were headed, or were at prior to this. The gentleman was a child at the time, and a young man, and his stepfather was retired Air Force, and they were going to the commissary to get their supplies. They would go every 2 weeks, and on their way back, they were near the, and for some reason I forget, the horse track, and Dave may know the horse track over there, but it was on the street on 70. Do you know which one it is by any chance? Oh, either way.
Fairmont? Is it Fairmont Racetrack?
Yes.
So, and then he's going, I think it would be 70. Wouldn't it be 70?
Sorry, muted.
Oh, that's right. I think it's 70. They were going over the overpass there, and they see this bright light off to the left. So the father or the stepfather sees it. He looks at this thing, and there's this beam of light coming down the middle, this bright beam of light, a very solid beam of light. He goes along, does a U-E, goes over to the ravine, shoots up, gets on the other side of the road, and pulls over to the side and just stays there. He gets out of the car in such, he's running so quick, he slips on ice and hits his head on the hood of the car. He gets up, and his son, the stepson, gets out, and the mother is screaming at both of them because they didn't know what the heck this thing is. And they're staring at it and just watching it. And here's this object hovering over this section of farmland. And these red lights are going off. It would go on one side and would go off to the next and go off to the next. And he says there were two tiers. You could see the tiers of what he referred to as panels or windows along the side. And this thing was massive. He was given some dimensions as to it, and pretty fixed in his dimensions. The object was clearly over 300 feet, 400 feet. I would say it'd be more than that. Other people were pulling off the side of the road, coming in back of them and watching this entire event, then eventually taking off. They decided not to take off. They watched the whole darn thing. As it gets up, the light sucks back up and it made a sound. He was able to duplicate the sound. It was like whoosh, it came back up, and all of a sudden the red lights start becoming brighter on each end and slowly move off. It goes over the trees, goes over the highway. They're following it. And he says, what is so unusual, and this is something I think Terry and a few other folks may be able to relate to, it seemed as though it crumpled in on itself and disappeared into another dimension and just gone. Well, that was, of course, the prelude to the renowned sightings that Dave handled down there in southern Illinois, Millstadt, Dupo, and many other locations. And it wasn't up until we started to do some work at UFO Hunters that Nancy Carpenter came forward with some video. And that was some remarkable video because there was an unusual characteristic seen in, and I'd say that was the triangle, which she was seeing as a triangle or quite possibly a flattened pyramidal type of craft. And I think that's similar to what we had in Tinley Park and possibly in these other areas. There were not just one object, as Dave could explain. There were multiple objects that were being seen. One that was that Mr. Knoll had seen, which he described being the flying building with what seems to be the panels along the back. Again, this could be a perspective of the very same craft, but not necessarily, because I believe it was a few other people came forward afterwards talking about the flying square triangle or square objects. The other objects that, of course, associated, and this point I'd like to mention, are the large orange orbs. The orange orbs are very commonplace. And another unusual object that was seen on October 31st in Tinley Park is the horseshoe-shaped object with the boom. And luckily, Dave had a case, I think from 1950-something, where in England, was it, there was a triangular object, and they had the horseshoe-shaped objects with the boom and the circle on top. I think that was in the 50s. You told me about that. And so there are other objects being seen, not necessarily the isosceles or the equilateral, but in this case, also a square-shaped object in southern Illinois in his sightings. Now, when we get to the Tinley Park sightings, which we all worked on it. In fact, Roediger worked on it. We had quite a few people work on it. I would like to bow and say, yeah, maybe, I guess I was the lead investigator because I'm still investigating the damn thing after all these years, Takes me a while to get something done. Give me 20 years, I'll get it done. So what the heck? Roswell's been going on for what, 60 or 70? Get a break, okay? And I'm still breathing. I got half a lung. I could get it done someday. Unless maybe Mr. Dennison can come along and help me and bump out a book. Who knows? The thing here is the mass sightings in Tinley Park were very interesting. On August 21st, 2004, which is, of course, the year of the weird, we had so many unusual things take place. And a lot of times when it comes to these cases, we don't look at other things that take place in and around the universe. I'm saying the universe of all the events going on, nature, seismic, meteorology. The other thing is human activity. We look at the mass sightings or the big sightings of the 1800s. We had all this mass amount of people moving to the Yukon. There were other things going on. So when you look at the historical things going on as far as the human events in 2004, the Gulf Wars, the seismic activity in California. And then, of course, we end up 2004 with the tsunami and earthquake in Indonesia. I'll end up real quick because I'm taking too much time. But in the case of the Tinley Park sightings, mass sightings, hundreds, if not thousands of people, not just one or two. And that is very important. Mass sightings give you a cross-section of a demographic, gives you people with different experiences, different knowledge base, and also advantages. And in this case, we are now in the day and age of videotapes. So now we have video recordings from multiple perspectives of exactly the same events at the same time, giving us a better idea of what in the heck we're looking at. And it wasn't just points of light and sky. People were seeing things that were solid. There was something in between. So on that point, I'm going to get going and we'll take questions afterwards.
Wonderful, Sam. Thank you so much. And you sped through a lot of those, and I have to throw in one thing because everybody downstate here considers this area central Illinois, and there is southern Illinois, and they get really mad at Chicagoans when they leave out the middle part of the state. But yes, and Sam, I think you and I need to sit down and do a full length, maybe Illinois feature, and we can invite some more pals to that one too. So we'll hear more from you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I think we're going to move it right along here. And Elliot Spiegel, would you like to take over now? We can hear from you. And yeah, I'm excited. You gave us a preview before we started recording, so now I'm chomping at the bit.
Well, it's great to be part of a group all talking about something that I am now familiar with, but only because of my own encounter. And it was just the way it all happened. It goes back to 1975. I was in the middle of producing the very first thing I ever did in the UFO field. I did a documentary vinyl record, talking voice record. Do we all know or remember vinyl records? Are we, any of us, old enough to remember vinyls? Well, I was putting together a documentary for CBS in New York. And I had already interviewed for that album Stan Friedman and J. Allen Hynek. They were the first two interviews that I did. I had never interviewed anybody about anything in the world. And so I chose them to be part of this album, and they agreed to do it. And so I was at home one day working on the production and the script of the album, and I got a call from Allen Hynek in Evanston, Illinois, and he said, "I know you're working on the UFO documentary, but I have to ask you a favor. I'm getting officers, police officers, sheriff's deputies, highway patrolmen, just general law enforcement personnel in the Lumberton, North Carolina area. And they've all been spotting something strange in the sky over the last couple of nights. And they've called me here at the Center for UFO Studies asking my help to investigate it. And I told them that I would do what I could. And frankly, I don't have anyone down there who could do an investigation, and I'm hoping you might have some time to go down and maybe do some interviews with the people who are seeing this strange thing in the sky, and you can send me some information about the interviews." So I said, "Well, yes, I'm interested. So tell me, Alan, what is it that they're actually reporting? What are they seeing?" And he said, "Well, here in 1975, it's something we haven't heard a lot about. They're saying it's something that looks like a large boomerang or a triangle, just flying around silently, and they don't know what to make of it." And I said, "Wait a minute. So you're asking me to go down to North Carolina to stop my work in the record for a day or two, and to check out reports of a flying Dorito?" I mean, basically, that's what it sounded like to me. And he said, "Look, if you don't want to go, or if you can't go," and I stopped him. I said, "Alan, don't finish that thought. You're the last person in the world that I want to piss off. And so I'm going, whatever happens down there." Because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking in 1975, if I ever was going to see anything, I was hoping it would be the classic saucer shape with the dome on top. I mean, that's what I was looking and hoping. But I figured, well, if Dr. Hynek thinks it's interesting enough and wants to send me down, I'll go. Ended up flying from New York to Washington to get another commuter flight from Washington to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where I was met at the airport and driven down to Lumberton and was taken directly to the sheriff's office. At this point, it was late in the day. The sun was going down, and I went right to the sheriff's department, where I started meeting some of the eyewitnesses. And mind you, these weren't even private citizens yet. I was only talking to law enforcement people. And so I had my tape recorder going all the time and just asking some basic questions that I had gone down there with. And also Alan Hynek had sent me or given me a list. Here are the kinds of things I want you to ask them, because I figured he would know better to tell me what to ask these people. I'd never done any investigation on anything like this before. So I'm in the middle of doing some of the interviews, and the sheriff's dispatcher, Ron Thompson, told me that they were starting to get calls from outside. The thing was back, whatever this thing was. And so off we went into one of the sheriff's cars with Ron Thompson driving. And we kept in contact with the other sheriff's people, highway patrolmen, police officers through the car radios. So everybody knew where everybody else was. And so that was pretty much at that point how we triangulated where everyone was, in which direction we were all going. And so we followed each other until we came upon an area, very, very rural area, mostly farmland. And we pulled up all the cars in front of a big field. And everybody turned off their car engines. The only sound that we could hear at that point was the sound of animals in the area, nervous about something. But we didn't know what it was they were nervous about. There was no moon out, so the stars had just started coming out. And we were looking directly across this field in front of us, and there was a line of trees going from left to right at the far end of the field. And as we looked in that direction, we saw a white light, very slow moving white light. And then it alternated from white light to red light. So it was going white, red, and it was slowly moving. So at that point, we didn't know if this was one object or more than one object. And then it just kept moving very slowly from our perspective of left to right. And then it stopped. And then it started moving slowly across the field in our direction. And we still didn't know what we were dealing with. I mean, how could we possibly know? There was no sound from anything except the animals in the area. And it got closer and closer and closer. And then finally, it stopped. It just parked itself right in the sky above us. And at that point, we realized it had no engine, because we would have heard it, whatever, even if it was a helicopter or who knew what kind of technology was available from terrestrial technology, would have made some kind of a sound. Not even a hum, nothing. It was just floating there. And at that point, we realized that it wasn't just a red light or a white light. We could see a shape, because it had one side of it was like this. It had a row of white lights, and the other side was a row of red lights. And at the apex of it, where the sides met, was a larger circular light. And because there were so many lights on the bottom of it, the lights reflected onto the object itself. And that's how we saw that it was a triangle shape, because we could suddenly see the shape, because it was that close to us and light was reflecting on it. So I'm looking from my right to my left, and Ron Thompson, the sheriff's dispatcher, he's standing next to me, and nobody's really saying anything. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not really scared. It was a combination of being excited and fascinated, and then when my heart started to beat very rapidly, then the scared part came in, because I started going through all this stuff in my head. What if this thing, whatever it is, what if they're here to eat us and to take us away? Because I had read abduction stories, and I thought, no, I feel pretty confident because I'm surrounded by people with their 6-shooters. And then I corrected myself and I thought, really, really? A couple of 6-shooters are gonna save me from this that's hovering above us? You know, you can't imagine, or maybe you can, for those of you who had similar experiences, what goes through your mind at the moment that it's happening. Part of you wants to run away, and part of you is just frozen, but not because of anything that it did, just because of how it made you feel. You know, you're just frozen by the moment of it. And as we watched it, from that brighter light at the apex of it, a beam came out. A beam of light came right down and hit the ground, right in front of where I was standing. And it, again, it made no sound. It was just a light, like a flashlight light. It came out and it got a little bigger as it wasn't just like a thin laser type beam. It opened up a little bit as it got to the ground. And it couldn't have been on the ground for more than, I'm guessing, 3 seconds. And then it just went right back into it. They turned the light off. And as we watched, all the lights on it turned off, and then the whole object turned a more amber color, and it very slowly turned about 45 degrees in the sky and started slowly moving off with no sound, and then sped away. And we're all looking at each other and we're going, let's go get it. You know, that was the attitude at that point. They're not here to get us. Let's go get it. And all I'm thinking of, Dr. Hynek sent me here. I've got to do something. I've got to give him good stuff. That was all that was on my brain at this point. And we got into the cars and we followed it through several counties. And wherever we went, because of the connection we had with the radios in the cars, we found various law enforcement people along the way who had just had their own encounter with this thing. And so wherever I stopped, I introduced myself to them, and they were happy to give us interviews and to just say, this is what we saw. 2 police officers were in their car, and they said this thing they saw came right up straight from the road in front of them, and it was moving pretty fast. And all of a sudden, without missing a beat, without stopping on a dime, it just did like this, and a 90-degree angle turn, and then it was off. I mean, without stopping. And then someone said, you ought to go talk to Police Chief Gary Moore, the police chief nearby, and he had something to talk about. And we followed him. We went to where he was, and we found Police Chief Gary Moore sitting in his car. He was the kind of guy where if I was going to be alone in the wilderness or alone in a back alley in New York City, he's the kind of guy I'd want to protect me, because he was like big, rough and tough guy. I mean, nothing scared him whatsoever. So he rolled his window down, didn't even get out of the car at that point. And I introduced myself and told him why we were there. And I said, I understand you saw something here recently that bothered you. He said, yeah, sitting here, eating my sandwich, and the whole inside of the car lit up. It was just a bright light. It was inside the car. And I said, well, what did you do? He said, I rolled down the window and I looked out. And I looked up. Now, remind you, this was April 1975, 2 years before the scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where Richard Dreyfuss is in his truck, and he looks up and he sees this thing parked in the sky above him. So the police chief said, this thing was just there, just sitting there. And I said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I grabbed our official, we have a big police lantern that we use for emergencies. It's in the back of the car. I pulled it out. I aimed it up at the thing and I blinked at it. And it blinked back at me. Ah, really? Now that's interesting, because, you know, at this point, I've got the tape recorder going, because I knew I'm going to send all this material back to Dr. Hynek so he could hear these on-site interviews. And I said to the police chief, anything else happen? He said, yeah. I aimed it up again and I blinked twice, and it blinked twice back at me. So I thought, well, you got my attention now. Actually, you had my attention when you saw the light coming into your car, but now I'm even more interested. Anything else happen? He said, no. It was as if the thing was saying, I'm done with you. I'm going to go somewhere else now and bother someone else. And so I met so many people that it was amazing to me, because I had no idea what I was encountering, and none of us did. And by that point, I didn't care whether it was a flying saucer with a dome on top or a flying Dorito. I mean, I knew that I had seen something great to be part of a group of people who were witnessing this at the same time. And I sent all my material back to Alan Hynek, and he eventually turned everything over to Jenny Zeidman, who worked with him at the Center for UFO Studies, and she created the entire report. He also had sent Ted Phillips, the late great Ted Phillips, who was one of the best known landing trace case experts in the field of ufology. And that's where I met Ted. And he came down just to see if there were any broken branches or marks anywhere where people thought they might have seen the thing lower than in the sky. And eventually the Center for UFO Studies published the report. And I believe that may be how Dave Marlar first heard about it, because he had information. Dave and I hadn't met at that point. And when he eventually got to writing the book about triangular UFOs, he included information about our sighting. And then I first learned about David, my friend, Dr. John Alexander. I don't know if you folks are familiar with Dr. John Alexander. Talk about a guy with an incredible history in the Army. And he's the kind of guy, if I was ever going to be lost in the wilderness with anyone, he's the guy I want with me. He could get you through anything, anywhere. He has been through the jungles of Africa and the Amazon, where he's been welcomed by tribes that won't take or won't allow white people to come in there with anything to do with anything else other than what the tribe people are involved with, like their own traditions. He was allowed to take pictures and videos and films of incredible things that were shown to him. And so he's been around the world. He and his wife have been to every continent on the planet. And John called me one day and said, there's a guy you should meet. His name is David Marlar. He's got a new book out about triangular UFOs. I think you two would like each other. And I think you need to meet him. And he was right. And I learned so much from David about the triangular UFOs. And it was only then that I learned that in 1975, really no one had heard about these things. We were just learning about them. This was years before the Phoenix Lights. And I'm not saying that there weren't many other reports of triangular Doritos, but the thing was, this was a time, and we're still kind of there, where there was much more ridicule about reporting something that you've seen. You don't want people to laugh at you and make fun of you. Your jobs, your families could leave you. There was a stigma in our country for a long time, and people didn't want to report. Stan Friedman used to take like a poll at most of his lectures, where he would say to people, how many of you believe you've seen a UFO or something that's unexplained? And a lot of hands, all the hands would go up. And then he would say, how many of you reported it? Maybe 1% of hands went up. Yeah. So there's like a lot of lost information still out there to be ignored. So
I agree with you on that point. You know, we always hear that there's always more sightings that are reported. And I think us having conversations and panels like this and getting it out to the public, I think that will help that. I think more people are starting to come forward more now than ever. And we just need to keep that trend going so we can collect this data. And, you know, as Valet said in his interview the other night on Joe Rogan, the more data you can collect, the more patterns we can see with the
Yeah.
data, and we can start to figure more things out. So
I was really happy. I watched that whole 3-hour interview with Jacques Vallée and James Fox and Rogan.
it was brilliant.
They all, what was great about it for me, it was totally uninterrupted, no commercials, just like 3 hours of great conversation. And Jacques very rarely does that where he's so open about his
Mhm.
feelings, because this man, he's more than a legend in this whole field. And it took me a while to convince him to become part of this little film called The Phenomenon. He didn't want to have anything to do with it at first, and he and James hadn't met. I introduced them because they don't live that far from each other on the West
Right.
Coast. And
Well, thank you for introducing them to each other. And
it was
that's a whole nother conversation for another time. And I don't mean to cut you off, Lee, but we are going to move it along. And that was a fascinating story. And there are parallels, like even with the cases Sam just mentioned, you know, it's just beautiful. And I'm going to push it along here to one of my favorite authors, and that's Preston Dennett, and he's going to share his triangle story with us. And yeah, Preston, take it away.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm excited to be on this panel, and not sure I deserve it though, because I'm looking back through all my research and looking for triangular UFO cases, and I have to tell you, this is pretty rare in my files. UFOs, of course, come in all shapes and sizes. I get mostly saucer shaped, honestly.
Well, now you have connections to build on your research. So.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I thought I would find more, because I do have some, not a lot of abduction cases or onboard cases associated with triangular UFOs. Do have my own really kind of interesting sighting.
Yeah.
I would like to mention just a couple others, which I think are kind of interesting and speak towards what I saw. I did interview a gentleman by the name of Rick Liebert, who was a special effects expert. He worked for NBC and did a lot of jobs using lasers and lights, and had a job in 1978 in San Diego where he set up an argon laser on top of a very tall building in San Diego, and got permission from the FAA, the whole deal. It was a promotion for a radio, and this laser would sort of go off and play in beat to the music of Pink Floyd and, you know, other rock stations. And so they set it up, they turned it on, and this was designed to attract attention, and it certainly did, but not the kind that I think they were looking for, because this huge kind of triangular shaped UFO, or boomerang shaped, comes swooping down. And he said it was very low. There was 10 witnesses, all saw this. It was maybe a couple of 100 feet over the building and extremely large. There was a second one that was higher up and looked smaller. He had some trouble estimating the size of this thing and how high up it was, because he didn't know how big it was. It was really a CE5, I guess you would call it. So that's one interesting case involving a triangular shape that I've researched. But again, not a lot. There was another case on Catalina Island involving Boy Scouts in 2016. They did see triangular UFOs. Done a lot of research off the Southern California coast here, because we've got USOs coming in and out of the water. And I have to tell you, it's a huge variety of shapes again. Cigar-shaped, praying mantis shape, spherical, blobs, sort of hexagonal, but not a lot of triangles. So I'm finding this all very interesting. One other brief case I want to mention before I get into my own is that of Bill Foster. I don't know if you guys have seen this book. Can you see it? No, it's not showing up, is it? All right. Yeah, Bill and Peggy Foster wrote a book called The Black Triangle Abduction. And this is a very, I talked to Bill personally not long before he passed away. He had an encounter in November of 1996 in Yadkinville, North Carolina, where he and his wife and 2 friends were all taken on board a very large triangular shaped craft. He ended up going under hypnosis and having a big, long, a lifetime of encounters, really, and was taken on board many times and finally asked these Greys, how big is this craft? Because he estimated it was about the size of a city block. And the Greys don't usually answer him, but they did this time, and they kind of smiled and said, the ship is as big as we want it to be.
Ooh.
So this kind of speaks towards that, how big are these things?
Yeah.
Because if you look at the Phoenix Lights, I mean, that thing was reported to be a half mile, a mile across, bigger. So this is kind of a question in my mind, particularly for my own particular sighting, which occurred also in 1996. I had met a gentleman by the name of John Wilkie, who kind of exploded onto the UFO scene around the same time as Tim Edwards of Salida, Colorado, who obtained some amazing footage by sort of blocking out the sun and filming through the corona. He got some really excellent footage of the cigar-shaped craft. Well, this is exactly what John Wilkie was doing. He got a lot of his footage on the television program Sightings and other shows. He contacted me because he wanted to show me this technique of how you can see UFOs and film them. And, I've had a lot of people contact me and try to show me UFOs. Some of my best sightings have occurred this way, but it usually doesn't work out. But it sure did in this case. He's like, what you do is you sort of look up, not into the sun, of course, but you block out the sun and you look at the corona and you will see stuff. And you do. You see little fluff balls, you see insects, and I wasn't particularly impressed. But every now and then I would see what looked like a craft dart by. I'm like, okay. And so I did this for a couple of weeks. And this is what happened. I was at my office at work, where I worked as a bookkeeper. This is the middle of the day. This is Canoga Park. Mind you, there's a million people in this town where I live in the San Fernando Valley. It's very densely populated. And I stepped outside of the building and I'm looking up. It's sort of high noon. The sun's right up there. And I step into the shadows so I can look up. And darned if I didn't see this huge triangular craft coming from the south, heading towards the north, straight over my head. And it was very hard to see at first. It was almost the same color as the sky, sort of blue-gray, and almost transparent. But as it got directly over me, I realized this was actually metallic. It was huge. This could not have been more than 3,000-4,000 feet up, just judging from the light scattering effect. I'm guessing a little lower. And as it got directly overhead, I'm looking at this thing and it's covering most of the sky. So I am estimating that this thing is 2,000 feet across. Really hard to say, but at least that. And it was definitely metallic. It was a perfect triangle, had rounded corners. They were not sharp. It had 3 indentations, one on each apex, which were fairly large and uniform circles and slightly either darker or lighter in color. I can't quite remember which, but there was a variation in color. And this thing is totally silent. For something that big, a plane going up at 30,000 feet, you can hear a jet. This thing was much lower. And as someone else mentioned, yeah, you don't react kind of how you think you would. I just kind of sat there or stood there dumbfounded and watched this thing move overhead. It took maybe 20 seconds, which is a fairly long time to see something like this. And it started to fade away as it moved off towards the north. At a 45-degree angle, I would say, was when it started to really disappear, like it was cloaked. Or if it was, I don't know if this thing turned itself on and off and showed itself to me, because I kind of had that impression, or if it was just the view that I was looking at. The technique is called solar obliteration. You can look this up. And yeah, it worked. And it's not the only time I did this. I was working close with my sister-in-law, Kisara, who does all the artwork for my stuff. And we were out doing this, and we went to her apartment and had a very similar experience. And it was, again, a triangular shaped craft. It looked bluish, almost like made of glass, honestly. And we watched it dart across the sky. There was a crowd of us, and I could track everyone's stare as they watched it, because it was hard to see. It looked almost transparent. So that was my encounter. It's one of, my top 10 for sure. A definite metallic craft. This thing had to be big enough to hold 10,000 people. So I don't think it's government. I honestly don't. I don't think most of these are. I'm sure some are, but hard to say. And yeah, that's my own personal case. I don't often talk about my own sightings, but just happen to have a really good triangular one, and do have some from others. Yeah.
That's wonderful to hear. So often we hear these recounts where it's at night, but you hear the same thing about that almost translucent, like being able to see stars behind them or through them. And it's interesting that yours were during the day, and you could say bluish and almost transparent. And that does speak to cloaking to me. I think it's fascinating. So thank you so much, Preston. Like I said, now you have some resources so you can dig and find more people to add to your work. And I do want to mention one of the solo interviews we did was with Melinda Leslie. And she had said, on her sky watching tours that, and these are always multiple witness sightings, that, she's seen around 9 to 13 triangles just with her sky watching tours that she does. But then right at the end, she snuck in a personal sighting, and hers was the first account I had heard of somebody being taken on board a triangle. So there are a few cases out there, and they're so interesting, and I hope we hear more to come. And I have a feeling you might be tracking them down now. So I'll look forward to that, Preston.
Hey, thanks.
And to move our panel along here, let's hear from Joe Burkes. He's been sitting in the sidelines, and Joe is somebody that I've fairly new friends with on Facebook, and I've just enjoy reading every single thing that he posts. So if you guys haven't heard of Joe Burkes yet, you guys need to find him on Facebook and get out your reading glasses and find a comfy chair. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, hi, Nicole. Thanks for having me on the show. And hey, Preston, how you doing? He and I were on the same contact team during the early days of the CE5 initiative. Before he wrote his 20 to 30 books, he was one of the best contact workers we had on our team. He was out there, even though he wasn't a night person, he would slug it out, go out at night, and we'd have our interactive experiences. So I'm going to try to keep it short because we're a little bit behind. Yeah, I'm a medical doctor now in retirement. Internal medicine was my training. During my youth, when I was young, Dr. Burkes, and even before, I was a peace and social justice activist. I was involved in civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. Even as a child, my mother was a trade unionist, brought me to demonstrations when there was atmospheric testing. And the United States and the Soviet Union were blowing up these enormous bombs, and the kids were getting irradiated, and you could find radiation in the deciduous teeth of children. So women all over the world demonstrated. I was with my mom back in the late 50s, early 60s. And then in high school, we had desegregation activities in the New York City school system. And then in college, of course, the Vietnam War. As a young doctor, I went to the United Farm Workers Union. I did some recruiting for doctors and nurses to get doctors to assist the farm workers in their clinics. And then as an internal medicine doctor, I was active in the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. That was an international movement of physicians trying to convince the leaders that, well, one nuclear bomb could ruin your whole day. And we did the medical consequences of nuclear war, where we'd actually educate the public as well as government leaders about what might be the consequences if a nuclear war actually occurred. Of course, that was during the Cold War, thousands of nuclear weapons on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And it was a far more dangerous world in terms of nuclear holocaust than we live in today. So I was never interested in UFOs. I liked science fiction. But in 1990, for reasons that I could only guess at, I went to the local public library, picked out a book. I said, "What do you got on UFOs?" And I read it on the subject. And then a year later, 1991, 92, I went to a meeting. And that was where I met I was working ER then, emergency room doctor, Stephen Greer. And that started a 5-6 year relationship with the CSETI director. I was the working group coordinator for LA. That's the team that Preston was on. But I also got to go to Mexico, and I got to go to England, and I had many sightings. And the technique that I used was, why do you rob banks, Willie? Because he was a gangster, Willie Sutton, he said in the 30s, that's where the money is. And so what our teams would do is we'd go to locations where we had a track record of sightings, and we would take along with us people who had a background in the subject. They were either contactees or abductees or had previous sightings. And as I continued with the work over the years, I've realized that there were some people who were like UFO magnets. There were typically men, but there was also a woman. I call them prime contactees because many of them are trained in meditation with no parental supervision as teenagers or young adults. They have ongoing telepathic communication, which what they think is extraterrestrials. And if you work closely with them, you will have many sightings, which was my experience. So it's like in Hollywood, how to get ahead. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And so I associated with these so-called primes. And my particular triangle sighting happened in 1993. And my relationship with the CSETI director, Stephen Greer, was problematic. I managed to stick it out for about 5-6 years. But we had many disagreements. They were political, they were personal, and they were professional. But we had a working relationship that lasted long enough for me to get a multitude of contact experiences and to observe UFOs with other contact experiencers with me in the field. That was very important. And so we'd heard about the Mexico City sightings it was 7/11/91. Mexico City had this total eclipse of the sun in July of 91, and hundreds of thousands of people saw a UFO underneath the eclipsing sun, and there were about 20 people got videotaped. So it was a worldwide interest in what was happening in Mexico, and was part of a wave of sightings that happened all over Mexico. So we scheduled what Stephen Greer called RMIT, which is not surprising, somewhat pretentious, rapid mobilization investigative team, like so much that Stephen Greer is associated with. Exaggerations were routine. So our rapid mobilization investigative team, which was planned for 4 months, went down to Mexico, and we positioned ourselves on the eastern slopes of Popocatépetl volcano. Now, if you remember your geography, some of the tallest volcanoes in the world are in Mexico, and this one, Popocatépetl, is over 17,000 feet high. It was also active when we were going down there, which is interesting. And then it was next to another giant volcano, somewhat shorter, that was called Iztaccíhuatl, which is the native language, indigenous, meaning the sleeping lady. That volcano wasn't active. And it was a 5-day investigation, and I got to see on 3 separate occasions triangular shaped craft. We believe it was probably the same one. And you got to remember that every night we would have UFOs going back and forth between the volcanoes. They would come right up to the rock face, and then they would, at night, turn off their lights and they'd disappear. These were not small airplanes. They were totally silent. So we did the meditation, thought projection, using the powerful lights, all part of what is called CE5. I prefer to use the term HICE, HICE, Human Initiated Contact Experience. And at 11:45, we were finishing one of our rounds of what's called coherent thought sequencing, which is basically meditation and thought projection. And between the two volcanoes, we saw a distant light. And at that distance, it was amber, but as it came closer, it was clearly red. And so the CSETI director, team leader, Greer, fired a powerful light at it. And prior to him signaling at it, it was going at an oblique angle, not towards us, but towards our general vicinity. As soon as he hit that object with the light, it changed direction and started heading right towards us. Initially, it was probably 5 to 7 miles away. As it grew closer, you could identify it, according to the theme of our discussion. It was triangular shape, a white light on each of the apices of the triangle, and a red light on the bottom. As it closed in on us, it passed over a ridge line about a mile away. And I had gone to UCLA to get very detailed maps of the area. So I knew that that particular ridge was a mile away. And on top, you could see a little church, maybe 50 feet across. This object was many times larger than the church. Stephen Greer made claims that it was 800 feet across. I think that's exaggeration. I think it was probably closer between 100 and 300 feet across. But in any case, as it crossed over the ridge line, we could see it was heading right towards us, totally silent. Now, I'd been doing contact work for all of about 6 months at that point, but you could imagine how exciting it was. This large UFO is responding to our signals. And as the team leader fired the powerful halogen lantern at it, the object would signal back, just as I think Elliot Spiegel described the police officer who shot up at the UFO. One flash from us, one flash back. 2 flashes from us, 2 flashes back. If I had had control of the light, I would have gone something like bum, ba-da-dum, bum, and see if it would go flash, flash. But anyway, it then started moving in an arc. It swept around at about half a mile from us and then came in, not towards us, but moving in front of us. And as it got closer and closer, the enthusiasm and the excitement, you can just imagine, because I'd been active in the doctors movement, and we had forecast terrible prognosis for the planet during the height of the nuclear arms race. Sagan, who was an ally in the anti-nuclear movement, Dr. Carl Sagan, had talked about the possibility of nuclear winter, wiping out all life on Earth. So at that moment, I realized we are not alone in the universe. Whatever the future of mankind is, if we destroy our civilization, at least we'll be remembered. And maybe, and in my naivete, I thought there might be some kids on an ET planet, and reading about the late, great planet Earth. But it was very encouraging to see we're not alone and that they were interacting with us. As it got closer, it turned on its side, sort of like belly up, which was interesting body language. And my estimate at that point was it was probably 200 to 300 feet across, because accompanying the object as it got within about 300 yards of our position was a saucer-shaped craft that, as it got closer, the saucer sort of shot up and took like a kind of command position. And the mothership, or the large triangle, came in. We were ready for anything, a landing, for sure. And as it got closer, just like in an imitation of terrestrial craft, a forward array of lights turned on, these enormous floodlights, as if to simulate we're coming in for a landing, which they did not do. The craft silently swung by us and then turned around. But even as it moved back towards the volcano, and I suspect many craft are based in the volcano, because there are videos showing a multitude of orbs and other kinds of craft that go in and out of the volcano. Even as it moved away from us, we signaled at it in a sort of a fond farewell, adios. It signaled back in response. So that was one night. The next night, things were not going so well because it was raining, and some local people didn't like the fact that we were on their land. So we heard a shotgun blast, and someone was coming across the field to find out what the hell we were doing. We were on private land. We immediately evacuated and moved our research and activities to an old fort from the colonial period. But at 11:45 at the exact time that the previous sighting had occurred. We had a sighting of another or the very same triangular shaped craft. As the team leader said, get your lights ready to signal. I don't know whether the UFO heard him or not, or there was a telepathic link, but even before we could get our lights out, it was signaling at us. This was an abbreviated experience because it turned and then dropped below the ridge line, didn't get any closer. And then on the last night that we were doing field work at that location, or at the same time, but at a much greater distance, the same or a similar triangular shaped craft showed up. So that's pretty much my contact experience in the triangle department. I managed to stay in CSETI for 6 years, but I, like so many other contact activists, I'd had it. I resigned because of personal and political and also professional reasons. I haven't spoken to Dr. Stephen Greer or seen him since. So that's basically triangles from the human-initiated contact experience point of view.
Mm-hmm. That was great, Joe. Thank you so much. And like I've said to a number of other of the panelists today, you know, I would love to do a full length with you. And I think there's so many facets to your career in this that we could probably do a couple parts with you. So I'd like to schedule that sometime soon. And I think we could have a lot to share and get out there for everybody. So in lieu of time and in lieu of that, I think we have Chase Williams up on deck, and Grant said he was going to give his own introduction. So this is a new face. I don't believe, Chase, I don't think you've come forward publicly in the community at all, although you've had contact with Grant. So yeah, I've been excited to hear from you. So I'm just going to let you jump on in.
Well, thanks, Nicole. I'm really glad to be here. And you know, everyone here, I'm familiar with most everyone's work here. So again, really glad to be here. I've known Grant now for, I guess, about the past 2.5, 3 years. We've been in contact. And yeah, my triangle event happened roughly 22 years ago. And I've always been interested in the phenomenon since that, even prior to that, although I was only 15. But I've never focused on this on a daily basis up until 2.5, 3 years ago. And my apologies, there's a cat that's trapped in a bathroom off my office that is crying, so she's fine. I'm not going to get up to let her out though.
She's answering my cat. It's doing
okay,
the same
there
thing.
You go.
That's why I keep muting.
So yeah, just a little bit about me. I'm a subject matter expert. I work for myself with respect to autonomous vehicular technology and advanced driver assistance systems. That's self-driving cars, but not just self-driving cars. I work on projects that are sea-based, air-based, land-based, and actually work with, on one of my projects, the former CTO of the Jet Propulsion Lab and various other talent within the industry. So I support major insurance companies and automotive companies, manufacturers, as well as other various tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 technology suppliers. So that's me. I'm an engineer, got a little bit of training in artificial intelligence. And so I hope that's helpful for you know, any audience that isn't a part of this panel, just, you know, hopefully to let them know that, you know, I'm just an average guy and relatively analytical. With respect to, you know, I thought this was funny. Elliot, you mentioned the 6-shooter thing. And when I was 10, I had my first experience, which wasn't a triangle. It was a light that followed my mother and I on a desolate highway in Texas on the way back from my brother's house real late at night. And it lit up the sky like day. But she made a comment after that experience. She turned to me as a 10-year-old and she said, I don't think they took us because of the dog we had with us in the Jeep. Her name was Dottie, Dalmatian. And at 10, I thought, well, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. If those are aliens, then a dog's not going to stop them. So I thought that was a really funny comment you made, Elliot. So my triangle sighting happened approximately in 1999, maybe 2000. I know it was around Christmas time because I was on the phone with my friend when this initially happened, and he recalls Christmas lights. So Immediately after this, I was 15. I went in, I drew this thing, I dated it, but it's been so long, I have no idea what happened to that initial document. So my mother and I had returned from, she had a small jewelry store in Beaumont, Texas. We lived in Lumberton, Texas. So, Elliot, you mentioned Lumberton, North Carolina. I've read that report before. It's interesting. And we had just gotten home. It was maybe 7 or 8 in the evening. I'm sure I ate a late dinner. I went outside. At the time, nobody had cell phones. We had a cordless, wireless phone. And I was on the phone with my friend, and we were talking about lights in the sky. And at the time, I was looking at what I thought was a satellite, which, in hindsight, is probably a star. I was looking at this, and I remember having a conversation with him about this thing changing colors. There's an effect there where if a star is low enough on the horizon, it appears to change colors. So I think that's probably what I was seeing. But at the time we were having this conversation, and I said something like, I wonder what the different colors represent. Maybe that's communication, some kind of radiant light communication to a ground-based, reception system or something. And from the, I have a painting here to represent this. This is easier. Okay, I'm no artist, but there's a little house right here, which was the house across the street, and the road that connected the driveway across the street from my own driveway, my mother's house here. From this side of the woods, behind the trees, this triangle appears. I'm sorry, this side appears this side. It's moving this way. So David, you mentioned in your presentation earlier that there are a few reports of vehicles reportedly moving backward. Mine was one of those. And it was also perpendicular to grade. So it was on its side, just like this. And it was moving this way at approximately, I don't know, 2 miles an hour. You could walk maybe a mile an hour. You could walk with this down the street. And I watched this come out from behind the trees and move across above the houses across the street from myself. My best guess is that this was maybe 150, 200 feet line of sight away from me, about 100, 150 feet off the ground, so very close. And the size of this thing, my painting probably doesn't do it justice, but I remember at the time thinking that's the size of a football field, so it was very big. We could use geometry and come up with some rough approximation, but it really doesn't matter. It was big. And it had 2 leading lights on each apex of this side of the triangle that were static. They weren't blinking. They weren't pulsating. They were just white. And then it had a red light on this point of the triangle that did blink, just like a regular aircraft light. Every 2-3 seconds it would illuminate and then turn itself off and repeat that process. And when it did, I could see the surface of the vehicle facing me, a third or 2/3 of the surface illuminate when that red light would come on. And it looked like, if you've seen the bed of a pickup truck and how it has those parallel equidistant lines in the back that's been sprayed with bed liner, looked just like that. It was flat black. I could see these lines that were perpendicular to the base of the triangle, or the leading edge of the triangle. Or I have that right? I'm sorry. Yeah, they would be perpendicular to the base, but I only saw it from this side. So, approximately this much was illuminated. I'm not sure what happened. Thinking back, I don't think I would have let my friend go, but and he doesn't recall, because it's been so long what happened. But I know at some point I was on the phone with him, and then at some point I wasn't. I know I had time to run inside the house. My mother had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, which is immediately as you enter the front door. It's right there. And I had time to run inside because it was moving so slow, look for a camera. There was a camera on an entryway table, and either the batteries were dead or the film had been completely used. And so I had time to check that and holler at my mom to get up and come outside and look at this thing. And I ran back out. She didn't get up. I continued to watch this until it never sped away at any phenomenal rate of speed. It continued on with the same forward momentum that it had. until it passed, too far away and the trees obscured my view. At which point my mother came to the door and asked me what was going on. And I told her, and I said, we can jump in the Jeep, we can drive down the street. This thing's probably right there. And she was not interested in doing that whatsoever. And I didn't get the impression at the time that she thought I was, making this up just to make it up. So, my friend at the time, I don't think he thought I was serious then, but after talking about this for 20 years, he realizes that this is something that I did experience. And he and I have experienced one thing together, an orb off the ground. This is about 7-8 years ago, in the middle of nowhere, 20 yards away, 4 or 5 feet off the ground, multicolored orb that came down from the trees and stopped and went away. And there have been several other things that have occurred that I could go into, but that's my story. Again, it's great to be here. It's great to hear David mention these backward flying triangles over the past 22 years prior to these last 2 or 3, in which I've just been incredibly engrossed in researching the phenomenon and having other experiences. Occasionally 2-3 times a year, I would hop on Google and I would look for those explicit artifacts of this type of sighting: triangle, backwards, perpendicular to grade, no light in the middle, light on each point. So it's refreshing to hear of others. Glad to be here again.
Beautiful. I just want to make a comment. Thanks for that. Just to let you know, mine was backwards too. The flat edge was coming to me in 76. And remind me to put you together with Bob McGuire, because you're working on UFO technology type stuff, detectors and stuff, and so is Bob. So I want to put you 2 guys together. Thanks for
absolutely.
And you brought the next witness.
Thanks,
maybe you can introduce Jeff. Is he still here? Because you introduced me to Jeff.
Let's see. I have a chat. Is that from? That's not from Jeff. I spoke to him earlier via chat, and he said that he was going to try another device. But it doesn't sound like he's on.
I still have him here.
Yeah, he's here.
Audio. Okay. So I wanted to say one more thing to Chase before we moved on. You held up your piece of art.
Oh, sure.
And of course I can see your 3 in the background as well.
There's quite a few here. So go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, we've been in conversations since this Utah monolith has appeared on how art may influence or how people might reflect their experiences through their artwork. Would you say you fall in that category of your sightings from when you were young? You feel like you need to express them artistically somehow, or is it just pieces people give you?
Yeah, no, not at all. I wish I was an artist, but it's not. These are really just for fun. So this is something that I started a year ago and I haven't finished. And this one I did for fun because it's something that I experienced. This is inspired by something I found online. These others, however, are, with the exception of this one, are other experience or artwork, pieces of art, unique pieces of art. So, I thought it would be fun to have a wall of experiencer art and get in various Facebook groups and try to find, these artworks that represent. So this is a spherical sighting that happened. Actually, it's my girlfriend's sighting here. This is one that happened in Florida. That does look like military technology. This is, I don't think this is based on an actual experience. And this is a rendition of mine, although the artist didn't quite get it right. You see, it's not perpendicular to grade, and the lines aren't perpendicular to the base. But and this one down here is really something too. No, just for fun for me to remind me that I'm not crazy.
Fun for us too. I've been looking.
Right.
It's very nice. But
thank you.
yes. So to move it along to Jeff Kingsbury, I believe he's another military witness, and I'll turn it over to him and let him introduce himself, and let's hear his story.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Oh yeah.
All right, great. Finally. Yeah, that took forever. My name is Jeff Kingsbury. I'm an infantry veteran. I'm an all-around adventurer and sailor. I bring veterans out on sailing, long haul sailing missions, and have them kind of recover from PTSD symptoms, whatnot. And I also worked in TV production for years. I worked in development for so long, and any chance I had to chase down a UFO story or possible thing, I'd love to get paid to fly to some small town to interview a bunch of people about their event. And unfortunately, about 99% of all the things I ever worked on TV never made it to the air or to broadcast, but I got paid for the work, so that's all right. But anyways, I'm here through Chase, actually. I interviewed Chase not too long ago because I've started a podcast like many others recently. And I also am a witness to a black triangle in 96. I'll just jump into that real quick. That's how I know Chase through a forum on or through a Facebook group we met. We talked there, but I was returning home to my house after school, after sports. I was playing, I think, football at the time with my mother in Taunton, Massachusetts. This is 1996, and this is the end of the summer. I'm not quite sure what month. I just remember my brother came home and he had Ultima Online. I had just come out, and I played my first online video game. It was amazing. Oh, multiplayer online game was amazing. But we're driving home. We pull in. We go back to the rear of the house and feed the horses. And they're acting a little wild. And that's usually just a sign that the people behind the house are acting up. And that was normal. But we put them away. That took a bit. And as we returned back to the house, which is only about 100 yards total walk, we had to walk past our garage. My mother suddenly screamed, "Holy shit," excuse my language, as loud as she could. And she bolted. She took off towards the back of the house and left her sweet son in the backyard halfway to the horses. And I reacted thinking I was about to get run over by a horse or something, because it was that's kind of a common theme over there. The horses would get loose once in a while. But I looked up to see what she was looking at, and suspended directly in the late afternoon sky was a cutout in the sky, a perfect black cutout with 3 lights on each corner, set a little bit in. And it was like a cutout of the sky. This thing was low. I mean, I said it was about 800 feet. I said it was sub-airborne, jumpers jump at 1,300 feet or whatever. And this thing was much lower than that. It was moving about, like Chase said, his was only moving about 1 or 2 miles an hour, the same thing. It barely crept. There was no sound around. We live right next to a swamp. We live next to, I was supposed to bring this up. I was told to bring this up because everyone around where I grew up wants me to bring up the fact that my sighting happened around Hockomock Swamp. I never add those two things together, but for the last 2 weeks, literally every single person told me to bring up the fact that I lived just a few miles from Hockomock Swamp. But this thing stayed over us about 10 seconds. My mother gets to the back of the house. She is screaming, "Jeffrey, get to the effing house." She's at the top of her lungs. My mother was not a woman that was scared easily. She was an equestrian. She's cross country jumping. She wasn't scared easy, but to this day, we talk about it, and the same reaction when you see something that looks like it should be flying, moving forward to not fall out of the sky. And it was just drifting slowly to the left, casting a shadow the whole way. And it drifted right over to our little swamp on the side of our yard and sat there for a few seconds, and then drifted over the road and over to a nursing home, the Taunton nursing home. And if you look it up to Google Earth or whatnot, it's just a short little thing. We could see the nursing home from where we're at. And over the whole thing took only, a few minutes, but it was rather mundane when it comes to some of the other sightings and I've heard and experiences I've heard. The strange parts about my sighting kind of drive me crazy, because my mother, sweet woman, great memory, but she has agreed with me, and we had the same story for 20 years. We had the same story that what happened. And as of late, for some reason, she has recently started telling me that the reason why she agreed with me is because she didn't want it to come back. So this is a woman who has no interest in UFOs whatsoever. She's not even, you couldn't bother her with it. She's a professional artist. She blows glass for a living. And she said she didn't want him to come back because recently, just before that happened, she told me that she had got off the phone with a friend who runs a huge Olympic horse barn over in, I think it's Bridgewater, Massachusetts. or it might be Rainham. I'm not sure. It was right on the town line there somewhere. And the lady would constantly call my mother to say, Jeannie, I'm seeing those weird freaking lights again over the swamp behind the barn. And my mother said every time her friend would call her to say something like that, she would have a strange occurrence a next couple nights later or something. And she thought that is exactly where that triangle came from. And that's why she never wanted to talk about it or mention it. But apparently my story was different from hers, because she said that it blinked and appeared out of nowhere, blocked out the sun, and turned the entire yard black. And that's why she screamed and ran. I don't ever recall it being so low that it would have blocked out the sun, because the sun was like 3/4 of the way down. But I don't want her objectivity to go out or be gone right at her age, but she watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode the other day, and now she's all freaked out and she refuses to talk to me about the entire thing. She doesn't want to be involved with it. But that pretty much set me on this topic for years. I used my love for the topic to like I said, chase down every story on TV I could. And before I left for the Army, I was in the delayed entry program, and I kept going on these little trips to this place called Paul Dever in Massachusetts. It's a closed down school it was formerly criminally insane for a short time, and then it was a school for the mentally disabled. And before then, it was Miles Standish in World War II, Miles Standish internment camp. And we used to go on these trips together with the privates all joining the military. A bunch of us had come back from the National Guard base training already, and we're going down to these steam tunnels, and we're checking them out. And we had an encounter with what we thought was a homeless person at first, just banging on the walls of the place, and ended up being what you could typically describe as, I don't even want to say it. It sounds so ridiculous. It's just, it was a giant-headed, a small, feeble-bodied figure standing in a doorway. And when we went back the next day to investigate with about 40 people, because we were so frightened, there was like a diamond-plated steel wall behind that door, so nothing was behind that door. There was no being standing there the entire time. So we all had a collective hallucination. I don't know what it was, but I just can't. We couldn't explain it today. I still am a complete skeptic, because it's just so ridiculous, both these events. But that's what brought me here. And I started, like I said, I started a podcast, and Chase hopefully is going to be on there with me, maybe reading the news every day, possibly. Chase.
What's the name of that podcast?
Oh, we call it Strange Recon.
Strange Recon. Excellent.
Yeah, and it's featuring a lot of military guys that I know that had a lot of paranormal experiences, and seemingly I like Chase, when I'm getting into the UFO topic, I had no idea that you kind of linked all paranormal topics together. I mean, with some objectivity and some skepticism, but these guys talk about UFOs and they talk about other experiences that accompany that, and it just blew my mind that it's so common that it just takes to get to know someone a little bit before they open up to you. Right away, they'll kind of.
It does. And
yeah.
We had when you began to speak and tell your story a little bit, we had an outpouring from our chat room about how wonderful it is that you work with others with PTSD, and they were wanting to know where they could link up with you and maybe get some people some help. So we'll provide that in the link, and that's why I wanted you to say the name of your podcast, so those people could get some answers and come to you and you could help out.
That would be awesome. It's still in pre-production, but I'm trying to take my time with it because we had some technical issues. But I hope to reach out to as many veterans as possible, and an alternative to awareness to PTSD. We're all aware about PTSD. We're all aware how bad PTSD is. It's time to go move past awareness and actually do something about it. And I love to sail, and it's a great way to get out there and just get your mind off of the past.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking back to maybe a couple months ago when I appeared on SOR, and we were talking about these latest military witnesses coming forward. And like you had just mentioned, it's so often we hear that they have a sighting, and like you just brought up, people don't know that all the high strangeness that accompanies just a sighting. So I had posed the question, was there any guidelines put in place with the military to help deal with these specific kinds of sightings, not just PTSD. We know there's programs, through the military that help. But, these are kind of a niche to themselves. So it's good to hear that there's folks out there like you that are putting, all these facets together and, can create a community. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I think you are our last guest on the panel. I'm clicking through. Lee Spiegel did have to leave us, so I told him I would say bye to everybody for Lee Spiegel, and I hope we can get him back for a full-length solo interview. But I think Desta's been watching the chat, and I think this might be a time where we'll turn over the panel to anybody else who has questions. So let me get to a full screen view here. Bob McGuire, I know you're probably chomping at the bit. Do you want to jump in and maybe start some questions, or?
What I want to do is just tell this panel, boy, what an honor it is to be on here with all of you. And so I got involved in this kind of storming controversy in the last 2 weeks concerning the photos that have come out of the Pentagon that Tim McMillan put up, because I had seen them a year ago, and this seemed the one that is posted a year ago, and got to take a look at it. The look wasn't long. I got access to it for about 30 seconds, zoomed in, and the thing looked like a triangle. And I said, it's a triangle with no lights. And sure enough, I don't know whether me saying all of that caused them to release it like the next day, but it was like the day after we had the panel, Tim got access to it and was allowed to release it. And my belief is they knew it was the one I was talking about. So they released it. So anyway, but what am I doing about it? So some of you may have heard of skyhub.org. So I was around at the beginning, and now the skyhub.org is run by a couple of guys, and you can go to skyhub.org and check it out. It has a great team. Why I was really interested in being on this panel today was, in addition to being on here with all of you, Peter Davenport was going to come on. So let me speak just a little bit for Peter Davenport and for Skyhub and why it's relevant. Peter Davenport, who runs New Fork and still daily writes down cases and puts them in the files, he is a very forward-thinking person. And 2 decades ago, he wrote a really interesting paper. And this paper was delivered at a MUFON conference. And in it, he spoke about how one might do passive radar and detect these triangles and get their trajectory, their velocity, and everything else, because they do appear to be metallic and radar reflective. So how do we do this? Well, let me tell you, just so you're aware, like Chase, I'm a technologist. I graduated with degrees in math and engineering from Auburn University, went to work at Sandia National Labs, left when I figured I would get a PhD, got a PhD in applied mathematics with minors in computer science and physics from Brown University. So then I entered a 3-decade-long career in the U.S. intelligence community and serving it. I retired from the U.S. intelligence community in 2010 and went and joined the Hume Center for National Security and Technology at Virginia Tech as a professor. And the job of the Hume Center is to talk young folks who might want to do science, technology, engineering, and math, but don't really have a clue what kind of things they might do if they work for the U.S. intelligence community or the Department of Defense or those corporations serving those interests. What is interesting to do? Because my own experience was, once I got in, I never wanted to get out, because the toys and the problems are fascinating if you're a technologist. So the thing that's happened is, in the last decade especially, the explosion in the capabilities and complexities and the ability to synthesize extremely complex sensor systems has just gone through the roof, just unreal. And the ability to take all these sensors and synthesize what these sensors are detecting into detection, classification, et cetera, which is enabled by inexpensive machine learning and artificial intelligence, we will not recognize this field in 5 years. So just let me talk about one piece, and as that piece which is relevant to Peter Davenport's talk. So first, let me lay a little more groundwork. While at Virginia Tech, I started 2 companies. One is Hawkeye 360, and the other is Federated Wireless. Hawkeye 360 is a geospatial intelligence company, privately funded, took no money from government. We built a set of satellites which fly over the ground and geolocate radio emitters on the ground. And the first 3 are up, the next 3 are about to go up, and ultimately be well over 100 of these spacecraft, and doing things that I patented, and people can go look at the patents. We're able to geolocate emitters on the ground with small antennas that people thought they would need an antenna the size of a football field by synthesizing this very explosion in technology I'm telling you about. And the way you do it is mathematics that you can apply to an extremely highly accurate, sensitive, stable, precise clocks, and the ability to tune the radios to the right frequencies. And you can find things on the ground that you never believed you would be able to find before. And Hawkeye 360 is doing that. If you check out the advisory panel, you'll realize that the entire intelligence community of the United States of America now realize that Hawkeye 360 has found the way. And people from NGA and NRO and NSA and DOD and DARPA, they're all now members of the board of advisors of Hawkeye. So we started it with private money, got the job done when nobody would listen to us. And the explosion in technology and inexpensive access to space are the things that have changed. So I also started Federated Wireless. That was based upon my long-term experience in doing software-defined radio. So Joe Mottola is known as the father of software radio. In fact, Joe and I both did it together inside the community in the late 1980s. So I've been doing software-defined radio since the 1980s. So this is a software-defined radio. It's called a Kerberos SDR, and you hook it to a Raspberry Pi, a $45 computer, and these 3 receiver ports you put into the USB port on a Raspberry Pi computer. And what you do is one of the antennas listens to a television transmitter or an FM radio station transmitter, and the other 3 antennas correlate with the reflections that come off of objects that are flying overhead. We now have the ability for $300 to do what Peter Davenport proposed 20 years ago that he estimated would cost millions of dollars. You can now do for $300. Okay, so that is being folded into Sky-Hub. What is Sky-Hub? Quickly, before I end. Sky-Hub is the marriage of all these kinds of sensors I've been telling you about to NVIDIA's embedded edge supercomputer for machine learning. And this is called an NVIDIA Nano. The most expensive of them is probably out of reach of most people, like $700. But the ones that I'm going to use for all the signal processing cost no more than a Raspberry Pi. They're NVIDIA Nano 2 gigabyte computer, and it has a GPU in it. It does machine learning and artificial intelligence, and it can synthesize these radar images just for anywhere you go, and it costs $59. Okay, the thing that's happened is technology is changing us forever. We will never, ever be the same in the sense that technology, machine learning, sensors, etc., can be fused together in a way that was not possible before the last 2 or 3 years. So Sky-Hub will take in camera, video, and images and synthesize that with all these other sensors, and Skyhub currently has accelerometers, inertial management unit, ambient the ambient stuff around it, like temperature, humidity, pressure, and so forth, as accelerometers, so we can tell, say, if a UFO flies over and distorting the gravitational field, the accelerometers will tell us, and since we know they're not moving, something else is changing the gravitational field, not us moving the box around. And so it controls these cameras, gets all these sensors, and it fuses all of that into a single set of messages and sends it off to the digital cloud. Skyhub has married itself in a joint venture with the Scientific Collaboration for UAP Studies, SCU. Rich Hoffman is kind of the lead of that. And we will give away the data publicly. The data will be stored openly in cloud storage. No one will control it, except we will assert by doing all sorts of little trade watermarks and other things on it that it has not been tampered with. The device itself will imprint a watermark on the data, so you will know, if you're a scientist, it came from Skyhub and hasn't been tampered with. Okay, so this will be made available. I'm currently supporting personally the digital cloud storage, but we need other people, because I want to track these triangle UFOs wherever they are. And in addition, so just my own, how did I get here? When I was 1, I had a couple of near-death experiences, according to my parents. And by the time I was 3, I had learned to read when nobody had taught me to read. And by the time I was 10, I was building radios, computers, built a telescope, memorized Grey's Anatomy from cover to cover, went off to college with my girlfriend at 19, driving home from college one Friday night. We found ourselves in the middle of the nowhere in the dark, and we had an hour plus of missing time. Within 2 weeks of that, I changed universities, changed majors, and became the scientist I am now, with no explanation to any family or friends who asked me what the hell I was doing. I just knew I had to do it. And so I don't know whether that's all that's led here. I'm just telling you how I got here. I got met when the videos came out of the Pentagon, introduced by TTSA and the people around it. I became interested and started studying, found that Richard Dolan wrote things that appealed to me with these national security UFO books he's written, joined the Richard Dolan members, became moderator and admin for the Richard Dolan Forum, and heard him interview Chris Bledsoe before they ever went on the air. Contacted Chris Bledsoe, asked him, could I visit as a scientist? And he waited 2.5 or 3 weeks to respond, told me yes, and I went over, and he told me, Chris told me that Jim Semivan had told him to allow me in. So Chris and I became friends, and in his presence, I saw multiple things that changed my life, including hitchhiked with my wife and I home, and did several things while we were a long way away from Chris Bledsoe. And since then, my life has not been the same, as you can tell, since I'm now here and not in hiding. That's it.
Well, Bob, ufology hasn't been the same since you've joined the team. So that's why we keep you around. We know you're full of information, and we know you're fighting a good fight alongside of us. And Grant, did you want to jump in here with any questions? We're right at 2 hours, I think, with our broadcast. So we'll probably try to wrap it up here shortly, but.
No, just a couple of comments. People have mentioned the triangle flying sort of backwards, which is what I had. And the thing about blinking the lights, I mean, we had a lot of that experience back in 1976, where they are very receptive to light. I just wanted to sort of make those comments there. And thank everybody for coming on, with the military witnesses. And it's been almost like a historic show. So there's a lot of stuff. We've got panel 1, panel 2. We did panel 3 last night, and then all the full length interviews that will be on your channel. So it's a huge amount of material that's been logged now in the last couple of weeks on Triangle. So it's congratulations on coming up with the idea, because I never would have thought of it.
Well, these things just come to me. Maybe it's part of my experience that, I shouldn't ignore anything where I think we should collaborate with other people. And I think panels like this, they reach such a broad audience. And afterwards, we always hear back from so many people about, and not only the audience, other people on the panel comment that they learned so much from hearing other people's testimony. And with that, Joe Burkes, you just dropped a few things in our chat that I think you should bring up to our audience at large. So please, you'll have to unmute yourself.
And anybody else that maybe has a comment to close before we go.
There were two questions. Desta said, was my participation for curiosity or something else? And the answer briefly is across all contact networks, the CE5ers, the Rama group, now called Rama with an H, the independent contact networks, people have been told to fly under the radar, not to be part of any existing network. I've met those people as well, or I should say, they found me. And we do this work out of a profound sense of mission. Sure, personal curiosity is there, but this, in our view, is for peace, for interspecies communication, for a discovery of what our position is in the universe vis-a-vis these other intelligences. And the question that I have for the panel, and for all those people out there who are viewing, is we've now witnessed an election where about half the American voters believe the election has been stolen from a standing president. And my concern is that as the general societal acceptance of the reality of UFOs continues to accelerate, what will stop special interest groups that are seeking to promote fear and conflict from taking over the stage and saying this is a threat? I think that the idea of actual conflict with the UFO intelligences is very low, because you don't have to be a genius to realize they are totally telepathic and they have access to people's full storehouse of memories. So with that kind of awesome psi capability, there's not going to be a war, but that this issue can be exploited and to promote conflict and fear. My hope is that we can come to some kind of consensus that whatever the phenomena is, ultimately it is non-harmful, and it's something that we need to learn more about from the point of view of promoting peace and cooperation, and not circling the wagons and embracing an approach that says these intelligences are somehow the enemy. That's my personal view. I bring that to the audience to discuss because I think it's of great importance.
Mm-hmm. I think we're hearing that echoed through the community. I brought up the Joe Rogan interview with Jacques Vallée and James Fox, and that was an emphasis that Jacques Vallée made as well. We cannot treat the phenomenon like a threat. And I think Grant and I tried to hammer that home on SOR last Friday. If we can't apply other human emotions to the phenomenon, why are we so apt to bring the threat narrative into play as well? So I think the outpour from the community is on our side. Nobody looks at this as a complete threat. Yes, there can be personal, scary sides to the phenomenon, but an overall global perspective, no, non-threatening. So thank you very much for commenting on that, Joe. I think the audience really loved it. And anybody else like to give some closing statements here? David, Marlar, I would like to bring up from the time that we posted this APB to the community of Triangle Craft and thinking about doing a panel, you probably received the most input from the community at large. Everybody was like, David Marlar, we got to talk to David Marlar. So just give us the title of your books, that everybody has seemed to have read. And I'd like to get that title out there for everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. the title of the book is Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation. And although it was published in 2013, I was just remarking to my wife just the other day, it seems like there has been more interest now as opposed to 6 or 7 years ago when the book came out. And I think a lot of that is the media's attitude towards the subject. I know in my lectures I've done locally, I haven't traveled because of COVID. I had 6 lectures across the country. I unfortunately had to cancel for this year, but locally, just doing some radio shows, I just did one yesterday. The amount of people that are telling me I wasn't interested in the subject until I started seeing mainstream news start to cover this. So we are at a very interesting period in time. And I think back to Jim and Cora Lorenzen with APRO and Donald Kehoe with NICAP back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were dreaming of the day that we're seeing now, where the subject has gone mainstream. And so I think it's an exciting time. I just want to thank you again for the idea of putting this panel together, because even though I've written a book on this subset of UFO reports, this panel demonstrates every single one of us have something to bring to the table. No to religion. Anyone that tells you they know what God wants for you, run the other way. All of us have a lot of questions. There's a lot of mystery to the subject, but I think everyone has a set of expertise that they can bring to the table. This panel is indicative of how ufology should be as a whole, that we all come together, we all contribute. We get away from the internet trolls that just want to tear apart any constructive activities that we try to put together. You know, we're not going to waste time with those people. We're going to work with people that are doing the work, putting in the time, putting in the intelligence to try to come to a better understanding of what we're dealing with. And today, specifically, with this triangular UFO mystery.
Right. Beautiful. Thank you so much. And yes, we often hear, you know, where's the one case, you know, is this case going to disclose? And I think all of us know it's never going to be the one case. It's never going to be the one sighting, you know,
Right.
It's never going to be the landing on, you know, a government installation that does it. We all hold a piece to this puzzle, and it's a beautiful thing when we can all come together. So thank you so much. Sam, did you want to chime in with anything?
Thank you.
Well, I always add, you know, what I've learned through these many, many years and through my personal experiences with them, that it's really not so much about them, it's about us, who we are, what we are, and why we are. And, you know, if we're going to do anything, maybe we should try to exemplify the term human and act a little better to each other. But once we get a hold of that, much like the meshing of gears, knowing what we are, who we are, and why we are, I think the phenomenon will fall in play. And when it does, I think we'll have a better understanding and maybe think of each other and ourselves a lot better, and maybe abandon our fears.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that
Thank you so
echoes another thing we've heard through the community. You know, it's not us, it's not the Russians, it's not the Chinese, it's not people in Africa. You know, we are a world race, you know, we are the human race. And I think the more we open our eyes to that, the more the phenomenon comes forward for us. And it's through the initiatives of Joe Burkes with Heiss and CE5ers and the Rama group that have kind of awakened that, I think, throughout the community, that it doesn't matter what background you're from, we're all in this together, and we can disclose this on a personal level and in the community. It doesn't necessarily have to be announced by a government. So I think we're moving in the right direction here. Terry, did you want to have any closing comments? I see you shaking your head and smirking, smiling a little bit.
You know, I'm just kind of listening and in agreement to the observations made. And, you know, you make a good point in that disclosure doesn't necessarily, probably won't come from the government. If there's such a thing as disclosure, it's going to come from a grassroots movement of people like us and people out there who wake up, and the collective amount of evidence, the great weight of the evidence is what's going to prove this to be a genuine phenomenon.
thank you for coming forward and doing your story. Maybe give the name of your book, and so people can track that down, because I highly suggest it.
Yes, my book is Incident at Devil's Den. It's on Amazon in print and Kindle, and I did an audio version. I have a new book due out in about 10 days. That'll be Devil's Den, The Reckoning, but that has one more edit to get through. But thank you.
We'll be watching for that one as well. And now I'll move it along to Mr. Books, Preston Dennett. I know you've got a couple in the works. Did you want to mention one before we get off today?
Yeah, I'm working on another one, very much like my recent book, Onboard UFO Encounters. People have had extensive encounters. Just put out one called UFOs at the Drive-In, 100 True Cases. I don't think a lot of people know about that. But yeah, it's been an honor to be on this panel. And with all you guys here, it's really amazing. I agree with Joe. I don't think this is a nefarious phenomena that we have to be afraid of. I think the ETs we're dealing with, their behavior falls under the same umbrella as human behavior for the most part, but is skewed more towards the positive. I'm convinced healing people is one of their main agendas. I've got 300 documented cases. And when someone's taken on board, if they're given messages of any kind, it's usually very positive. Warnings of environmental disasters, against nuclear proliferation in our warlike ways, or being taken to the engine room and shown how the craft works and told we don't need fossil fuels, or very strong spiritual messages. So I'm very positive about how this will all roll out. I know there are people who do have negative experiences, so I don't want to, disregard them. But ultimately, I do think we will be seeing disclosure. I do. And our government at some point is going to have to admit this. And when that happens, I think we're going to start seeing more open official contact. I do think we're looking at a very different world coming up, and it might take a while. We'll see, but I'm pretty excited about it.
Beautiful. And Chase and Jeff both here on our panel. I know you guys are relatively new to the scene, but I have a feeling that you guys might kind of explode a little bit here after today, and people want to get in touch with you and hear more of what you have to say. So was there anything closing that you would like to put forth?
I would like to add and really appreciate that. And again, I just want to reiterate how grateful I am to be here and to interact with all of you. I think it's really valuable that we all come together as well. Everybody has a different perspective here. I certainly haven't been keenly focused on what we call the phenomenon my entire life. Some here have been involved with this on a day-to-day basis for 30, 40 years, maybe longer. And like I said, in my little bit earlier, it's only been every day for me for about the past 3 years. But over these past 3 years, I've had my own CE5 or human initiated contact event, several as a matter of fact, over these past few years. And I think that Sam and Terry and Tom and the others are probably right. I've come to my own conclusion that this isn't really extraterrestrial like most people think it is. It's more related to what consciousness is, and that's the explanation as to why everybody has a slightly different experience. It explains, Preston mentioned spontaneous healing or healing via quote unquote alien abduction, and there's so many things. And this is why Grant Cameron's work, with contact modalities is so important, because he brings everything together, and you can start to see how all of this is connected. Once you have a human initiated contact event or CE5, call it what you will, doesn't matter. You realize that occurred because of something you or the group of people you're with were thinking, which is in and of itself reality shattering. That, this initially my thought was, well, maybe they've evolved to a point technologically where they can interface with thought, but I really don't think that's what it is. I think they are interfacing with a field of consciousness. And Bob mentioned the work that he's doing. 8-9 months ago, I started building a ground-based vehicle for excursions to study this stuff with really high-tech instrumentation and controls. That's what I do. I'm a perception guy, and now I've gotten to the point. I'm still building the vehicle, but I've gotten to a point where I think, no matter how good of instrumentation you stick on the platform, whether it's static or dynamic, it's not as good as you yourself. We are the ultimate sensor suite. And if we can have an experience based on thought, then we don't really need a camera. So I think once the greater public becomes aware of that connection to whatever this is, things are going to change. So really excited, and if I get some people emailing me, that's great. But I'm really excited to be here, and hopefully that resonates with at least some of us here on this panel.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Chase. And last but not least, Jeff, is there any closing statements you'd like to make?
Of course, I'd just like to say I'm absolutely grateful and honored to be here. And I've looked up to a lot of you people for a long time. And you've changed my mind about a lot of things, actually, some of you. And I've been pretty stubborn on some topics, but you actually, some of the statements from very logical people help change kind of like newcomers to the field, like myself, pretty fast. But I do want to say that I hope to interview some of you guys, in the future, relatively soon. I'm sorry for putting Lee to sleep. And I hope that we can do this all again sometime. And it was great. Thank you very much for letting me be a part of it.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you all so very much. I think I've said enough for today. Grant, if you wanted to chime in and close us out.
No, just thanks to everybody for doing it. This is a very powerful panel. I think it'll go a long way at a timely period in history where everybody's looking at triangle sightings, and I do appreciate everybody. Nobody really turned me down, so thank you very much for coming on and making this a fantastic panel, and hopefully you can do it again sometime soon.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Let's all give a big wave. Thank you, everybody watching live. Maybe we'll be back for another one in a few weeks. We have so many people in the crowd that are wanting to share their stories as well. So this
you, Nicole.
Is ongoing. Thank you so much. Grant, Desta, thank you for doing your part in the background, and we'll see everybody soon.
Beautiful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, see ya.